Previously, in the drone tech series, we discussed about how we can decode PPM signals using STM32 board and generate PWM signals accordingly. We also used a servo motor and operated it with the generated PWM signals. This time we'll be talking about a totally different topics on how we can attain 6 different flight modes using our RC transmitter. Namaste everyone and welcome back to the channel. So recently I needed 6 different flight modes for my drone operation, and they were loiter, auto, RTL, circle, alt hold and stabilized flight modes. But the transmitter has maximum 3-way position switch. So in order to attain that, I discovered something known as mixing. Obviously not this kind of mixing, but you get the point, right? So we'll be talking about RC mixing in this video. On searching on the internet, I discovered 2 combinations that I tested for achieving the 6 different flight modes. So we'll talk about the first combination. So in this, we have channel 6 as our master and channel 5 as our slave. The endpoints for channel 5 is 85% and 50% respectively. For channel 6 it was 100% in both. Next, in the mix settings, we have 2 mixes. First one is for channel 5 as a master and channel 5 as a slave. Then channel 6 as a master, channel 5 as a slave. The respective settings are already listed. We'll be setting these settings on the transmitter as well. Once the settings are entered into the transmitter, you can see that flight mode 1, 2 and 3 are achieved in one position of switch, and 4, 5, 6 is achieved in the second position when your channel 6 goes to the other end. We'll discuss all of these technicalities further in the video. Next, in combination 2, we can see that only one mix is on. We have channel 6 as our master, channel 5 as a slave, positive mix 4%, negative mix 50%, offset plus 17%, and the endpoints of channel 5 are mentioned as well, 67% and 50%. Channel 6 is 100% for both in this case as well. Next, let's enter these settings into the transmitter and see what we achieve. In this combination, you can observe that flight mode 1, 3 and 5 are achieved in one position of channel 6 switch, and flight mode 2, 4 and 6 are achieved in another position. So let's move on. Now we will discuss the technicalities involved in this mixing. We'll start with endpoints. So what is exactly endpoints? Let's see. So typically in the RC industry, we know that 1000 microsecond and 2000 microsecond are the end of a particular switch. For a 3-way switch, it would also include the midpoint 1500 microsecond. For a 2-way switch, it would be 1000 and 2000 respectively. Now for 100% L and H endpoints, what we get is that 100% of these values are reflected when the switch are moved to that particular position. Now if somebody says that 50% endpoint, what does that exactly mean? It simply means that 50% of this particular gap between the midpoint and extreme ends. So if I say for the lower end, we have 1000 microsecond, midpoint we have 1500 microsecond. So the difference is 500 microsecond, right? For the upper end, we have 2000, or higher end, we have 2000 microsecond, and the midpoint is 1500. Again, the difference is 500 microsecond. Right? So if somebody says 50% L and 50% H, the range would be decreased for the overall PWM that we can achieve. So in this case, it would be 1250 microsecond, 1500 and 1750 for 3-way switch, and for 2-way it would be the 2 extreme ends, that is 1250 microsecond and 1750 microsecond. How did we achieve this? It's easy. 50% of 500, that is 250, right? So 1000 microsecond plus 250. 50% of 500 is again 250, so 2000 minus 250, that is 1750. So we reached at a point which is 50% of this particular range between the midpoint and one of the extremes, right? So okay, let's proceed next. So we know what would be the values for 100% endpoint and 50% endpoint. But what about 75% L and 75% H? Think about it. Alright, Let's see what it would be. So in case of 75%, you can see that 25% is from one of the extreme and 75% is from the midpoint to the lower end. Again, on the right side, we can see that from the midpoint to the extreme, we have 75%. From the extreme end, we have 25%. So it's easy. 0.25 of 500 is again 125. So to achieve that particular point where 75% endpoint meets, we get the value 1125 microsecond. For the midpoint, it is again the same 1500 microsecond. And for the extreme end on the right, we have 2000 minus 125 this time, because we have to reach at a point 25% less than the extreme. So that is 1875 microsecond. Hope the maths is clear. It's pretty simple. Next, we'll enter this endpoint in the transmitter and see in the Waveling inspector what are the values that we achieve for this particular RC channel. You can see for the endpoint 100% on both sides, what we achieve on the RC channel in Waveling inspector is the same as we discussed: 1000, 1500, 2000 for 3-way switch and 1000 and 2000 for a 2-way switch. Again, for mix settings off and endpoints 50% and 50% respectively, we get 1250, 1500, 1750 for our channel 5. For channel 6, since we have kept the endpoints to 100%, we get 1000 and 2000. If we have kept 50%, again we'll be getting 1250 and 1750. So that's the case. Now let's talk about mix settings. So what exactly is mix? Mix is, in layman's term, it's like we have two channels, a master channel and a slave channel. And when we change the PWM value of our master channel, what we see is a change in PWM values at the slave end. Mostly it's used for controlling certain parameters of your flying aspect, like aileron, elevator, throttle, and relation between them both. But here we are using it for only changing flight modes. I'll be attaching few articles and videos. If you're interested, you can have a look at what mix is and why it is used in the RC industry. So first, in the mix settings, we'll be talking about offset. So we'll be discussing both plus and minus offsets. And for example, we'll be taking 10% offset. The endpoints would be 100% in our first case. In the next case, channel 5 will have 50% and 50% endpoint, while channel 6 will have the same 100% endpoint. So let's proceed. So the offset 10%, but 10% of what exactly? It's the difference between the two extremes. So channel 5 right now has 100% endpoints, so the two extreme would be 1000 and 2000. The difference is 1000, and 10% of that 1000 is 100. So we'll be adding 100 to the values. But since 2000 is already at an extreme of our right hand side PWM value, so let's add 100 to the other two values, that is 1000 and 1500. That will eventually result in 1100, 1600 and 2000 microsecond values for our 3-way switch, and obviously 1100 and 2000 microsecond for our 2-way switch. Next, when we keep the offset to minus 10% value, what we achieve is that we'll be reducing 100. Now since 1000 is already at the extreme of left hand side, we'll be reducing 100 from 1500 and 2000. So that will eventually give us 1000, 1400 and 1900 for 3-way switch, and 1000 and 1900 for 2-way switch. Now let's move to 50% endpoint for channel 5. For the 50% endpoint, the extreme would be 1250 and 1750. The difference would be 500 in this case, and 10% of 500 is 50. Basic maths, right? So this time we'll be adding 50. But since we know that 2000 is already an extreme, we'll be adding 52,000, this time 1250 and 1500. So that would eventually give us 1300, 1550 and 1750 as our values for 3-way switch, and 1300 and 1750 for 2-way switch. Once we shift the offset to minus 10% for endpoints 50%, we have to subtract 50, and since 1250 is already at one extreme, we'll be subtracting it from 1500 and 1750. That would give us 1250, 1450 and 1700. So there's a mistake here, it's not 1550, it's 1450. So whatever we have discussed, now we'll enter those values in the transmitter and eventually see its effect in the Mavlink inspector. So hold on tight. So you can see for offset plus 10%, endpoints 100%, what we achieve is 1100, 1600 and 2000 in the 3-way switch. And since the endpoints of channel 6 is still 100%, so the values we get is 1000 and 2000. For offset minus 10% and endpoint 100%, you can see the values 1000, 1400, 1900 respectively for 3-way position switch. And again, since we have 100% offset endpoint for channel 6, we get 1000 and 2000. For offset plus 10% and endpoint 50% for channel 5, we get 1300, 1550 and 1750 as our values. And for offset minus 10% and endpoint 50%, we get 1250, 1450 and 1700 as our values. In the upcoming video, we'll see and discuss about the other mix settings, which are positive mix and negative mix. Also, we'll understand the calculation behind creating this particular endpoint and mix settings to achieve the 6 different flight modes from scratch. So stay tuned for the next video. Do not forget to like, share and subscribe the channel. Thank you.